The Absolute Universe line of monthly comics has sold over 8.2 million units in total, not counting the December figures.
I haven't had a lot of time to read, but right now Absolute Batman is the bottom line of everyone's lore right now. We all know the story of Batman. So yeah, always that new energy. New energy brings new storylines, and always thinking outside the box can give you a whole different perspective on something that you thought that you knew for your whole entire life.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Nick Dragotta. Who is he? Well, Nick Dragotta is an American comic book artist. He's become very well known because of his work on the best-selling title, Absolute Batman. And I would argue that a big part of this book's success is not just Dragotta's art style, but his storytelling specifically, which is, I'm going to argue in this video, heavily influenced by the pacing and the techniques used in manga. Today I'm going to discuss what Dragotta has adapted and pulled from manga in terms of pacing and design, while still retaining, of course, his own unique look. And I'm going to do that through comparative looks at issues of his creator-owned series, East of West and Good Devils, as well as Absolute Batman, bolstered by quotes from Dragotta himself. I think it's an exciting look at how artists working in the monthly grind can still find ways to evolve their artwork and find new ways to communicate with their readers. Folks, if you like this content, beyond hitting like and subscribe, I do have a Patreon, and there are ways to get extra bonus episodes over there, including stuff that otherwise YouTube would not allow me to share. Without any further ado, let me tell you about what I observe about Nick Dragotta's artwork. Nick Dragotta knew that he wanted to work in comics, and he earned himself a degree in sequential art from the Savannah College of Art and Design. His first work as a penciler in comics was a fill-in issue of X-Statix in 2004. He also did some early work for DC on The Losers. It's worth looking at a few of these pages to understand what his early art looked like so that we can compare it to his work over 20 years later, today's art. It took him a few years to get regular illustration work in comics. He spoke about breaking into CBR back in 2017, saying, quote, "When I was coming up in comics, there was a grant called the Xeric, started by Peter Laird of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I can remember trying to get one back in the late 90s. I didn't receive one, but the 15 or so submission pages I drew for the Xeric grant led to my first comic job at Marvel. It was a very useful experience, and that opportunity led to another." You can see a little bit of Dragotta's style in the faces, mostly the eyes and the mouths in my opinion, but it's not what it would evolve into, at least not yet. His earliest work has flashes of pages with unique panel designs, but a lot of it does follow a relatively standard 5 to 6 panel layout that is very common in comics. He also has dynamic poses, but maybe not quite the foreshortening that he would use in his modern art. I admire Dragotta's early comics artwork. The line work is bold, but not too busy. It's not too cluttered with meaningless detail. He focuses on a good pose and thick lines to make his characters stand out. It's not too far from what classic artists like, say, Alex Toth might give us. A good amount of Nick Dragotta's earliest work is fill-in issues or collaborations with Mike Allred, who has a style that I think it would be fair to call retro. It's very influenced by Ditko and Kirby. And I see some of that in Dragotta's earliest work. Aside from the fill-in issues at Marvel and DC, Dragotta worked in graphic design and animation adjacent fields in those early years, and I think that may have helped give him a slightly different focus on visual storytelling than artists who are primarily influenced by only comics. He has clean composition, Dragotta has strong silhouettes, and I think he has an understanding of motion that's influenced by cinema and cartoons. There's a focus on the effect of an action. I'll get more into that later. He co-created America Chavez at Marvel with Joe Casey, and he had a nice run on a Fantastic Four spin-off with writer Jonathan Hickman. But his real breakthrough and the beginning of him pushing his storytelling in new directions came in 2013. That was the year Dragotta started making waves with the creator-owned series East of West, where he collaborated with writer Jonathan Hickman on a post-apocalyptic western that follows death protecting humanity from his fellow horsemen of the apocalypse. The first thing I remember noticing in that book was a different pace, a little more relaxed, not cluttered. I remember seeing this establishing shot of a futuristic city and being impressed with its mix of complexity balanced with really clean lines. It reminded me of French comics, bande dessinée, with artists like Moebius. It made me start really paying attention to how this artist was communicating the story to me, and noting that it just felt a little different from everything else I was reading in American comics at the time. That was confirmed when Dragotta began speaking about East of West in interviews. For instance, at the 2013 New York Comic-Con, there was a panel about East of West, and Dragotta mentioned that the manga Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo and Knights of Sidonia by Tsutomu Nihei were both influences. Those were not the first touchstones that I had in mind as a reader, but I can certainly recognize that both of those manga feature environments with complex machinery. It's inventive, but there's a verisimilitude to it. It feels authentic. And if we look at the city shots in East of West, that's one similarity. Another is the cool design of Death's motorcycle, which combines what I would say is a bullet shape with legs that are much longer than a horse, but it's still equine. Ultimately, that kind of detail is window dressing, though, for setting the scene. And a lot of artists have pulled from manga for mech designs or even facial features. Dragotta still drew his characters his own way. In fact, if anything, over time he toned down some of the exaggerated expressiveness of his faces compared to what you might see also in manga. Dragotta addressed that specifically in a 2013 interview with CBR, saying, quote, "For a while, I drew my comics and overacted everything. Wide eyes, open mouths. Everything was over the top. Now, I think it's much better to use that sparingly and let the reader inject themselves into the character by trying to draw more of a subtle emotion. Do the eyes have a soul? For me, that's where I try to start. And then, over time, the characters will just start to come alive. Comics visually speak a universal language. Add to that just the right words, and you can feel it in the gut. Current masters like Naoki Urasawa, Goran Parlov, and Richard Corbin do this consistently. I want to tap into that magic. I strongly recommend East of West. It mixes a bunch of genres and tells a truly epic story. I'll show you some pages and panels while giving you a quote from Dragotta about his decisions that he shared with comicbook.com back in 2014. If you read manga and that sort of decompressed storytelling, it's usually one word balloon per panel. And those are the kind of comics that I like. Not where you're having 4 word balloons per panel, and that happens with us too, but if I have the time, I like to try to expand and smooth out the storytelling and try to create those beats. I just take all the comics from all different genres. I love all different types of manga. I love a lot of European comics, a lot of South American artists, from Juan Jimenez to Moebius, and artists in Japan. I like to look at this stuff and get inspired, and then usually the deadline hits and you just gotta crank. So all of that stuff gets filtered subconsciously and comes out onto the page as something new and different. So this is a good time to jump forward even more, and I can lay out what I'd argue manga does that's a bit different from comics. And I think it's worth looking at manga techniques because clearly there's a lot of audience interest. Sales in 2024 topped 700 billion yen, which, just to be clear, is about $4.6 billion US. And that was up from 1.5% from the previous year. Manga accounts for almost 45% of all publishing in Japan, and it's obviously huge in America, where in the same year it accounted for over $1 billion, and it's rapidly growing. There are plenty of artists influencing each other worldwide, but those sales indicate to me that it is worth looking into the storytelling to see what we can learn from manga. So let's jump to last year's book, Good Devils Don't Play Fair with Evil, by Nick Dragotta and David Brothers, comprised of 3 short one-shot stories. The first is an especially good example of Dragotta using manga techniques. Let's listen to Nick in his own words while I show you some of the images.
For me, it was probably the first project where like I went all in on trying to create like a manga.
Yeah.
I think it was like my first experimentation with speed on the page, you know? So, and then also the stature. Like I really brought this over to Absolute Batman too, because on my most recent trip from Tokyo, they had the Fist of the North Star exhibit.
Yeah.
Getting to see all of Tetsuo Hara's artwork and how he worked and the influences. Like I remember I was there with Daniel Warren Johnson, James Herron, and I was right next to Jim. We were looking at this art and we were like, everything's got to go bigger. Like what we lost these vibes of like this machismo in the art. It just seemed so cool. Like everything was just ratcheted way up.
The stature is a great point. If you read Fist of the North Star, and I strongly recommend that you do because it's entertaining and influential, you will see that size plays an important role. The hero, Kenshiro, goes up against enemies whose size can fluctuate depending on what the story is emphasizing. But in fight scenes, his opponents, who are supposed to be human, can be drawn as absolute giants. But Fist of the North Star is intentionally over the top, and it emphasizes these things for dramatic effect. I'd argue there's a balance between going that far over the top and finding a bit of a story reason to make characters at such a scale. And Absolute Batman absolutely threads that needle. Let's specifically take a close look at issue 14 of Absolute Batman, where our hero battles villain Bane, who uses a drug called Venom to increase his muscle mass. And I'll break down some common manga tropes and how Dragotta seamlessly integrates them into an American superhero comic. Not just stylistic flourishes, storytelling techniques. On page 1 of this issue, we see a lot more panels than what would typically be in a comic book. A comic will frequently utilize something close to 6 panels to indicate plot progression, while manga often uses lots of inset panels to show small actions and emotional beats. For instance, if I show you several panels of some fight manga, it isn't just a big punch or kick for one character or the other, but all the small moves to position themselves, reaction shots from the opponents, and how the environment and characters within it are being affected. This more decompressed type of storytelling is becoming more common in comics, but it can still be more focused on dialogue and plot over here. Nevertheless, Absolute Batman finds a way to balance both, while leaning towards highlighting each event with anticipation for an action, movement, impact, and the reaction to that sequence. I think it's fair to say that manga works to give the reader a greater sense of immersion into the scene. This is also backed up by subjective camera angles. In other words, shots from the point of view or a third-person view over the shoulder of what is happening from a character's perspective. These shots, for instance, of Bane reacting to a falling building, or the surprise reveal of Killer Croc, are examples of that type of subjective camera angle. Another could be this shot of Batman running up to attack Bane from behind. These shots encourage reader participation, placing them in the character's shoes. Let's compare how manga will use a cinematic approach to action and how Absolute Batman mirrors that. In Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo, there's a bike chase sequence. We get a wide establishing shot. We get rapid close-ups tracking angles, panel shapes changing with the speed, background blur or speed lines. It's got a particular rhythm. Now, if we look at one of the fight sequences in this issue of Absolute Batman, we start with an establishing shot of Bane and Batman in an empty stadium. As the action begins, we quickly cut to some close-ups. We get a tracking pair of shots that have that subjective view I mentioned, and then, when Bane catches Batman, he hurls him into the ground, and the background only then gets the speed lines to sell the impact. This is followed with some panels to show Batman, Bane, and an ally of Batman all reacting to these events before things are reset with another wide shot, this time of Bane about to be attacked in the stadium by Killer Croc. While a sequence like this isn't completely foreign to comic books, it's just as likely that we'd get a more standard grid of the key moments and a lot more dialogue. The shots here tend to be more objective, and the motion is shown through the posing and gesture, not as much how the panels are selected or including as much of reaction shots. The pacing can actually feel slower because there's often a good amount of dialogue to get through within panels, even in fight scenes. Let's look at how internal thought is presented. I'll take a look at Death Note for this because that's ultimately a story about two clever people trying to uncover the other person. When they lay out a plan, we see a layered inner monologue. There can be diagram-style visual breakdowns, subtle facial changes instead of big reactions, and it can take several pages. The tension is what is happening inside the mind. If we look at most American comics, this was often condensed into panels with big thought balloons laying out exposition, not nearly as visually engaging. Absolute Batman is ultimately a hybrid, but we get this great epilogue that reveals Batman had a plan to fight Bane 2 days ago, and it's full of shots of what he plans to do with the Venom drug, contrasting images of a boxing match that his friend, who was turned into Killer Croc, was having, close-ups on Batman beating Bane, interwoven throughout all of this, and the reactions of the police. It's a lot more engaging than 1 or 2 pages of dialogue or thought balloons. Similarly, manga gives more breathing room for emotional beats. Let's look at Naoki Urasawa's book Monster, about a doctor hunting down a serial killer who he feels responsible for since he saved his life. Sometimes we want to get inside the character's mind to feel things from their perspective. For scenes like this, we can get silent panels or at least very lightly dialogued panels, a focus on hands, posture, the environment. The background details can often mirror the mood. And ultimately, the page turn will punctuate the emotion. Now, in Absolute Batman, we get this scene. Batman's friend is about to be hurt by Bane, and Batman leaps into action. On the next page, we get a silent shot of Batman dropping down onto Bane with the background a surreal blend of speed lines and deep red indicating injury and pain. Bookending the panel are flashbacks to a time when Batman was slow to stop this friend's boxing match. On the next page, we get the emotional punch with hardly any words. Batman slices Bane's back open, saving his friend this time. No hesitation. He's also going up against a Bane whose size is getting absurdly large. It definitely reminds me of scenes in Fist of the North Star where Kenshiro goes up against gigantic opponents. The scale and stature bring menace. Because this is a comic book, there's a bit of a reason for that. In this story, the drug Venom makes Bane heal and grow. But then this book goes back to manga influences by making Bane overdose on Venom and grow into a massive blob of muscle. It's very reminiscent, intentionally so I would argue, of what happens to Tetsuo in the manga Akira. And in the coda to the story, we see another of those scenes showing a character thinking about things, but this time it's from the perspective of what's left of Bane. Nothing more than a brain and eyes in a glass tank. And he's forced to watch as his home country is bombed out of existence. Manga may do a close-up on eyes to show an emotional reaction, but this moment dials that up to 11 by showing us an eye that can't close being forced to watch everything he cares about being disintegrated. Ultimately, comics and manga, for that matter, bande dessinée, fumetti, quadrihinos, manhwa, webtoons, they're all using different forms of the same idea. Visual, sequential storytelling. And they're influencing one another faster and faster as the internet gives us fast access to news stories worldwide. A lot of comics are adapting these techniques. I think if you were to read, for instance, Do a Powerbomb by Daniel Warren Johnson, or Orphan and the Five Beasts by James Stokoe, you'd be exposed to similar storytelling ideas. But mainstream serialized superhero books are a little slower to adapt those influences. These days you might get some creator-owned books adapting that. That'll happen a little bit faster. Creator-owned books also have a lot less barriers to entry. So it's just a little slower for mainstream serialized superhero things to adapt new techniques. But I think that the pacing of Absolute Batman is one element, just one element, that's helping it excite readers. It's a different way of exploring a Batman story. And I will give credit to writer Scott Snyder for clearly giving the story room to breathe and to let the art tell the story without feeling the need to fill it up with dialogue or narration boxes. Nick Dragotta excites me because he's not an overnight success. He's been working in comics for a long time. But if you track his work, you see that he's taken steps to allow his artwork to evolve and become something new. A lot of artists working at the fast pace that comics and especially manga demand get locked into their style and never experiment. That is clearly not the case here. So, do I recommend Absolute Batman? Yes, very much so. And also, everything else that I mentioned as reference points. East of West is great, and so is the series of one-shots in Good Devils. Great, great books. Tell me who out there in American comics you see utilizing techniques from abroad. That could be manga, that could be bande dessinée, it could be something from South America or Italy or Spain. But I'm just curious, like, what are you seeing that you feel is new within American comics? I'd love to hear those replies in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and subscribe. I'll talk a little bit more over the credits, but this was my look at Nick Dragotta's style and his storytelling. Thank you so much. Keep reading comics. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this far. And thank you to all the folks that are supporting the show. Sincerely couldn't do it without you. So I have added a monthly extra episode that's exclusive to my supporters on Patreon or my members on YouTube at the $2 and up level. And basically I'll do something that you can't do and monetize, like look at a comic that has nudity or excessive violence, or honestly, like maybe I'll do something where I look at some music related to comic books. I've got an idea for that. I've got a bunch of ideas, and all of a sudden I was like, well, I might as well make those exclusives something that you can't share on YouTube to everybody. So they're exclusives for my supporters. But I do one of those a month. I appreciate the support. Just something I'm trying to give back to everybody that's doing that. And also, if you enjoy seeing me look at the techniques and try to make these observations of what it might be influenced by, I do a weekly show on a second channel called Comic Tropes After Dark. And on Monday nights, I will talk about the news of the week as it relates to comic books specifically, and then I'll review the comic books that I picked up, and I'll try to talk about the techniques. I've been talking about both Nick Dragotta and Hayden Sherman a bunch lately, and it made me realize, geez, I need to just make a dedicated edited episode. So thank you for being patient while I put this together. Getting the images takes a long time. The editing process for these videos is very time consuming, but I appreciate all the support. See you real soon. Bye. Jack, I'm trying to record, buddy.